I'll see all my beautiful people, my beautiful Niji brothers and sisters out there. I hope you're having a beautiful, blessed day out there. Today we're gonna get into why Martin Luther King was really assassinated and what was he really was trying to tell us. I'm gonna pull up the clip right now for y'all. Just a second. Let me dim the lights real quick. Let's get it.
The Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West.
Pause. Now what I have to say right here, what he said, y'all, when he said America refused to give the Negroes, which was us, the so-called Nijis, the Indians of this land, when he said they refused to give us any land, and he said the government was giving away millions of acres of land to the Pilgrims. See, at that time, he was talking about Abraham Lincoln passing them Homestead Act laws, and Theodore Roosevelt also. But we all remember when Abraham Lincoln passed that Homestead Act law. Go look this up. They was bringing over more pilgrims over from Europe to mechanize our farms, to set them. They was trying to set them up with an economic floor to mechanize our farms. That's what he said. That's what got him killed. But anyway, our ancestors had to teach them how to farm. That's what the Homestead Act laws was about. And our ancestors, you know, we took them in and we taught them how to farm, but our ancestors only did it because they thought they was going to get something out of it. They thought they was going to get a profit out of it. See, they was making broken promises to our people, man. They ain't keep them. Let's get it though.
West and the Midwest. Because, however much America strays away from the ideals of justice, the goal of America is freedom. Which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. Which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. America has given the Negro people a bad check. A check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But not only did they give the land, they built land grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. With government money to teach them how to farm. The life of the Negro.
See, that's what got him killed. He said they built land grant colleges and we had to teach them how to farm, man. Check it out, people.
Still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Used and scorned though we may be, the Negro still is not free. Now, this is what we are faced with. They provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Our destiny is tied up in the destiny of America. And this is a reality. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here.
You hear that? He said before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts, we were here. Peep game. They landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and Virginia first. Peep game, y'all. Peep game.
The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land and finds himself in exile in his own land. And finds himself in exile in his own land. Finds himself in exile in his own land. The Negro still is not free. Not only that, today, many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. So I refuse to despair. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. Now, when we come to Washington, we're coming to get our check.
See, that was the march at Washington was about. To come to get our checks, man. Because they owe us. They still owe us, you feel me? They still owe us, man. They still owe us a check. Fuck begging them. It's time to come together and assemble, man. We can assemble our own government, man. We can do this ourselves, y'all. We need to start a Black Wall Street again, man. I know a couple. It's a couple indigenous nations, man. That's doing their thing, man. We gotta get back to it, y'all. They owe us, but fuck keep on begging them motherfuckers if they ain't gonna give it to us. They owe us millions, man.
Okay, everyone. Now, I want to present to you some very important details pertaining to what you just watched during the introduction of the segment, because it all correlates with each other when it comes to the truthful information that I present to you throughout all of my content. Now, I do want to note here that I understand that many of you may have heard what Michael King at birth turned Martin Luther King stated numerous times in the past, or even in present videos of clips of his past speeches. But I also understand that millions of so-called African Americans or blacks just merely bypass King's descriptive hidden messages inadvertently. So allow me to break down a few reasons why, and also go into detail about what every indigenous Neji should be made cognizant of. King's most highly favored and nationally popularized public speech immediately became the talk of the town per se amongst everyone in North America soon after its completion. In front of a mammoth amount of people of all complexions on August 28, 1963, King delivered an impeccable, formidable, encrypted message, famously known as the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C., just near the Lincoln Memorial. King stated numerous facts and then detailed some rather harshly disturbing but yet relevant burdensome factors surrounding the so-called Negro in North America, from racial discrimination to environmental injustice, for example. Then he referenced issues concerning police brutality and even the United States citizenship neglect of the so-called Negroes. King was heavily criticized by many Caucasian Americans of European and African descent, along with many of his fellow people that shared the same hue of complexion, merely due to his early motives and agendas where he promoted the ideology of equal rights and justice for all Americans, no matter their ethnic backgrounds. What's very important to note here is what King details in front of those millions of people, that the Negro is still not free and held in exile in America, and America is in fact the Negro's own land. Now, between the many times King was interrupted with responsive chants like, as if King was quoting scriptures during this time, it would have been almost impossible to truly understand the real message that King was presenting to the public. But you better believe that someone or somebodies caught on to King's descriptive poetic justice quite clearly. See now, King's definition of freedom was totally different from any dictionary ever written in history. Why? Well, all dictionaries and other language books alike are written by biased foreigners or descendants of biased foreigners as their government so authorized. See, the English language is merely nothing but a modernized version of Latin that was forcefully indoctrinated into the mindsets of our indigenous ancestors of this land through a manipulative system of forced schooling by way of a, quote, Sunday school classroom setting historically held by colonizationalists who were best described as pastors, ministers, and priests, just to recall a few, who worked directly with the many denominations of the Christian society. And that's a whole nother story within itself. But speaking of mindsets, King's definition of freedom was that to be human and to be free are one and the same, merely because all humans are born free. But the flip side to this is that one's freedom can be difficult to attain due to one's self-incurred immaturity, when they tend to follow self-proclaimed superiors without thinking for themselves, for example. To be quite frank, one immediately gives up his or her freedom once they conform to American society without any question. In order to become free again, one must overcome this level of immaturity and have the courage to use his or her own understanding. And that is exactly what King was trying to assist the masses with. See, besides all of the new information you hear about King's personal life, that's all of a sudden being released now by the federal government and the Alphabet Boys only 50 years later after his assassination, when it was the King family that literally sued the United States government and the U.S. Army for King's assassination and won, and put the court records out to the public for anyone to see, and no news media outlets covered that, not even so-called black news media outlets at that time. Martin Luther King Jr. was under fire from multiple entities during the latter part of his life for one big reason. Not only because he was being hailed as an unbiased popular political figure, but because he also induced his followers to become individualists, or rather known today as free thinkers. Then the tables began to turn for the worse for King as time went on, and this actively enabled King to have a change of heart rapidly, especially after progressing in stages of some personal, quote, soul searching, as he described, more logical maturity thinking, and lots of descriptive researching that led him into nearly the deepest point of the rabbit hole. Now, in between 3 to 4 years later, after his most popularized I Have a Dream speech, you began to notice the difference of opinions that King struggled with during his early stages of activism. The style of his presentations of his public speeches became more complex and very unusually unorthodox, straightforward, and distinctively positioned for the observer to pay much closer attention to detail. For example, in a speech dated April 14, 1967, 1 year before his assassination, King unexpectedly delivered yet more details of acknowledgement when it comes to the so-called Negroes, indigenous aboriginal inhabitants of this land, now called North America, prior to colonial times.
Our destiny is tied up in the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here.
This is also why the majority of the mass media outlets, whether white or black owned, refuse to popularize his most recent conscious content of facts, opinions, and truths that he presented around about 2 or 3 years prior to his assassination.
If y'all see, y'all always wonder why they always talk about Y'all wonder why they always talk about his "I have a dream" speech, but they never bring up this shit he was saying right here. This real shit he was saying. Peep gang. Peep gang.
Assassination. In fact, those that have released some of his most latest work made certain to edit out King's critical, unconventional answers to some great questions given by those particular news media companies that had their own agendas. For example, in this interview, listen to the question asked and watch what happens soon after.
To get the right to vote established. Now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
Well, why is it not possible? And this gets back, I suppose, to the color of black. For a nation to see that an investment along the order of which you're talking about, 2 or 3 billion a year, may be an investment in the future if you add up what welfare costs and all the rest of it, dislocation in our community. Is it still the problem of color? Let's say we don't have the war.
Now, you can make the argument that this footage is a little over 50 years old and technology was up to par according to its time period. And I'll agree with you. However, I will also add that not everything is a conspiracy, but not everything happens out of pure coincidence neither.
I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare.
During the latter part of his life, King's change of heart allowed him to pull away from his earlier campaigning of racial integration, equal rights, and justice for all, and weigh in heavily on the duplicity of the federal government. According to a 1967 quote from King, he stated, "I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government." Now, some people might say that they never heard King talk like that before, and that's only because of how King encrypted his messages earlier in his life. But he did, however, provoke that same fear into the government for those very same exact reasons. It's just that over the years, more and more people began to follow King and allure themselves into violent actions that King was falsely accused of provoking during his non-violent approaches throughout all of his campaigns. Then, the final straw for the government with King was when King began to point out how the Negroes of the lands of America were used not as slaves, but as indentured servants for the uprising of the European regime in America. Once King established the Poor People's Campaign and made the mistake of publicly announcing his new overall agenda, it backfired, and unfortunately it cost him his life, along with a few of his family members' lives as well. The speech that cost King his life was the speech that many copper-colored people today are truly not paying attention to detail. Allow me to break this down. After visiting hundreds of so-called black communities over time that are suffering from the dark, heavy-loaded conditions of poverty, this time around, King listened to a rather poor mother of color that explained her current position in detail that provoked King to lose his cool, to say the least. Not long after the exchange, King decided to deliver the truth to the people and what he planned to do about it.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land.
Now I want to note something here.
That was what that Poor People Campaign was about. Going down there and that march to Washington, when he said we going to the bank to get our motherfucking check. Nigga, this is our shit, man. This is our shit. Facts, man. It's our shit.
Really quick, before I go any further, When you hear the term slave, I don't want you to picture the indoctrinated common visual of chains and shackles from some illustrated storytelling of lies. The truth is that these self-proclaimed superiors you are inadvertently giving power to had no true slaves, but rather prisoners of war that they made numerous promises to in order to quell their revolts of retaliation. For example, you see today that America still has the highest count of correctional facilities and the highest incarceration.
I told y'all about them Homestead Act laws. They promised our people something out of that shit for us to teach them how to farm. They promised us that we was gonna get something out of this shit. We never did. You feel me? That's why that's what all them revolts was about. You feel me? They made promises to stop us from revolting and shit. You feel me? Shit crazy, man. They ain't really want them problems, man.
Population. And those prisoners are ordered to wear chains and shackles for a correlating reason. Oh, and let's not forget to mention which race of people are the majority of the...
They had to get, listen, they had to get Martin Luther King up out of here because he was rallying the people up and making them remember what had happened about the lies they was telling them, that they told us, all them broken promises and shit that was made to us, man. They didn't want us to get together and rally and take our lands back. That's what we need to do. That's what we need to fucking do, y'all. Get it.
The federal government's slaves, no matter if they are guilty or not. So if anything, you can say that our ancestors were mentally enslaved, not physically. There is a big difference. The spells of their language they forced upon our indigenous ancestors runs deeper than one may assume. Now, to get back to what I was saying, the prisoners of war were made promises by their supervisors or managers that they will be granted specialized benefits, business ownership, plenty of American money, or land ownership once their forced obligations of servitude expired.
Broken promises.
I mean, now think about this. If a so-called slaveholder and his small family that came from a totally different continent kept about, let's say, 7 to 10 so-called slaves near his house daily, and they were continuously being treated bad and
we wasn't no slaves in shackles picking cotton. We wasn't in slaves in shackles picking cotton on them fields getting beat on with whips. That's images they show y'all to instill fear in y'all. Them was lies. They was on our farms. They was picking cotton off our farms. We was teaching them how to farm and how to pick cotton properly. They try to show it like we was slaves and shit. We was out there picking cotton getting beat by whips. Nah, you feel me? They was on our shit, man. They was squatters. And we took their kids in and everything. They had to bring their kids for us to feel sorry for them, to take them in. Shit crazy, peak game.
beaten, etc., and ordered to build the slaveholder's house, cook their food, and upkeep their farm that the so-called slaves built them damn selves, would you and those other 6 to 9 slaves just sit there and take that because you wanted to? Or because you were made a promise, just like the others, that you need to work for the white man in order to survive, earn money, and be granted some land? Well, now you know why the majority of our ancestors worked, not as slaves, but as indentured servants, because for one, they knew these lands very well and tried to be friendly with these foreigners who had other plans in mind. Did you catch that? What was the need to go through a hassle of allegedly forcefully immigrating enslaved Africans from Africa all the way to America when America was already populated with our indigenous ancestors in the first place? See, that manipulative lie was told to you as a fear-mongering tactic in order to depict that one race of people are somehow superior to others. When King stated that through an act of Congress, the government was giving away millions of acres of land, he was referring to the Homestead Act of 1862, in which just a little over 30 years prior to this law, our ancestors' cultures, heritage, history, identities, resources, and lands were stripped away and became possessions of the federal government in order to be distributed to the, quote, free whites that immigrated to America from Africa and Europe during the early 1800s.
Which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. Which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor.
The Homestead Act of 1862 granted these white peasants, as King describes, our lands that were stripped from our indigenous ancestors and all of the specialized benefits the federal government promised our ancestors by peace treaties that they would receive for being 90% of the help they needed in order for the United States to win all 61 documented wars that occurred during the 1800s alone. Side note, the Emancipation Proclamation abolished all forms of slavery the very next year in 1863. The so-called free Negroes and the so-called freed Negroes, along with the so-called freedmen, were royally upset and disgusted with the federal government. So they continued the multiple rebellions until they saw a change. The Homestead Act of 1866 was established by the government that allowed the Negro 40 acres and a mule. But the catch was that the Negro had to buy the land, and the price of the lands were lowered just enough so that the Negro could not afford it still. This is what King meant by America refused to give the Negro any land. These homes...
Shit crazy. They promised us 40 acres in the mule after that Emancipation Proclamation. After the Civil War, remember the Civil War wasn't nothing but a labor dispute, man. See the rebellions. That was the rebellions. Us, the Confederates. That's us. That was our military. We went to war with these motherfuckers. You feel me? We went to war with these motherfuckers. And they they said, okay, fuck it, we give y'all the land, but they said we had to pay for the shit. So they raised the taxes high enough so that we couldn't afford it. Peak game, y'all. Peak game.
Homestead Acts gave these foreigners government-funded assistance, where the government hired our ancestors to teach these foreigners how to farm.
Not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm,
Because keep in mind, a true foreigner or immigrant wouldn't know how to grow anything in a mass area of land that they are not accustomed with or never inhabited before in their life. This is why King stated our farms.
They provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms.
That should also show you how our ancestors are truly indigenous to this land and not anywhere else, because America's environment and climate is totally different from any other continent you choose. Soon after the Homestead Act of 1866 was passed, the government made it even easier for the white foreigners from Africa and Europe and gave them a full-course meal on a silver platter and fed each and every one of them with a silver spoon.
Today, many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, when we come to Washington,
we come to get our
we're coming
check.
to get our check.
A few days after he stated that, he was assassinated for speaking the truth.
Now, ain't that something? Now, ain't that something?
I'm just here
Now, ain't that
to
something?
make you think.
Now, ain't that something? Now, ain't that some shit, y'all? Cut this light on. Now, ain't that some shit? Y'all never forget. That's why they had to get Martin Luther King out of here, man. He said they was bringing pilgrims over here to undergird them with an economic floor so they can mechanize our farms. That's why when them Homestead Act laws in 1862 that was passed by Abraham Lincoln after the Civil War, around 1865, 1866, when we rebelled, he raised the taxes high enough so we couldn't afford that shit. So it was
Log on to patreon.com/Dane Calloway or paypal.me/Dane Calloway to support me.
But I hope I gave y'all some great information. Shout out to my brother Dan. And I love y'all. OCO, my beautiful people. Shout out to my beautiful Neezy brothers and sisters out there, man. I love y'all. What up?